The Gospel of John has been haunting me this entire time. It is too exclusive to follow the Synoptics, yet there are some parallels. It's been an enigma, but today I think we're going to close the door on that problem. The answer to the Gospel of John problem is the Acts of Pilate Form 1, also known as the Gospel of Nicodemus. And again, I'll be talking about Part 1 because there's no guarantee that Part 2 was authored by the same person. In reading through the 5 gospel accounts and comparing them to the Acts of Pilate, something kept standing out. First, the Acts of Pilate is written as a first-hand account. It's attributed to someone around Pilate and Nicodemus. Now, while Pilate obviously makes it into all the synoptic accounts, only John refers to both Pilate and Nicodemus. And given the Matthew parallels to Form 2, we can exclude Matthew and Luke from this discussion. Acts of Pilate Form 1 can only relate to John, the Lord, and Mark. Now, on similarities, Form 1 is similar in ways to all accounts, but the lack of Nicodemus by Mark and the Lord is glaring. In John, the mention of Nicodemus is partial. It mentions him 3 times in 3 different situations. First, it mentions him as having a vision of Jesus at night. The text actually says Nicodemus visited Jesus at night, but I'll explain later why I think this is a dream. The other 2 mentions of Nicodemus are odd. The middle account is just a small mention of Nicodemus defending Jesus to the Jewish priests. The Jewish priests have arrested Jesus, and Nicodemus by this point is somewhat of a follower. The last account of Nicodemus is in John 19. It mentions coming in and preparing the body of Jesus for burial, so in John's story, Nicodemus is rather important, and in no way does this character get transferred into the Synoptics. Yet, here's the Acts of Pilate written as a first-hand account, and it is drenched with Nicodemus. There are 3 extremely important characters here: Pilate, Joseph of Arimathea, and Nicodemus. Of course, being written as a first-hand account, the Acts of Pilate mentions some things, but not others. It's written as sort of a mystery as to what exactly happened. The only version of the John story that transfers into Pilate is the idea of Nicodemus as a defender of Jesus and as the preparer of the body, which actually makes sense because the first account is private and the final account is part of the mystery of the missing body. Now, in reversing the idea and trying to get from Mark or the Lord to the Acts of Pilate, the obvious problem is why would the authors never mention Nicodemus in their accounts and then flood the Acts of Pilate with Nicodemus? It makes no sense at all. There are parallels, but none of them are particularly strong. The only solution here is that Acts of Pilate Part 1 must follow John. It must be an expansion of the story according to John. However, there's another issue with John. It boils down to the end of chapter 20 and the end of chapter 21. We're not sure if chapter 21 is original, but it doesn't really matter. At the end of both chapters, the author simply says there are many more accounts, and that it wasn't his intention to flood this specific book with it. Regardless of which chapter is the real ending, the John author draws the line. He has more stories, but they aren't going in this book. Where his extra stories end up are likely in the Acts of Pilate. It becomes quite clear that the Acts of Pilate is an expansion of the last few days of Jesus. It's written as firsthand, and this is ultimately the problem. The likely explanation is that John came first. The Acts of Pilate was either written by the John author or by one of his followers. This account essentially became a historical document that other authors took very seriously. Some stories make it into the other Gospels, but they quickly drop Nicodemus from the story. Being a Jewish priest visiting Jesus may have been problematic. So at this point, the Acts of Pilate appears to be the pivotal account. It's the bridge account between John and the Synoptics. John has priority over Acts of Pilate, and Pilate has priority over the Synoptics. Pilate may have been adjusted several times between John and Matthew, and we don't know exactly what form Pilate would have been in. But this solves the problem of connecting John to the other accounts. It also explains why it took so long to accept John into Orthodoxy. The Orthodox lineage was opposed to the Nicodemus-Jesus connection, and Nicodemus is not necessarily a huge part of the story. The story can be related without Nicodemus. There are some small indicators that the synoptic authors probably had John, but saw it as almost entirely heretical. Instead of John, they preferred the Acts of Pilate. So not only does John, by accident, create the synoptic tradition, but he also denotes a massive division in early Christianity. It's a division that won't be resolved until around 170 to 220, and even at that time, the resolution of this problem is going to result in a whole bunch of heresy claims. At this time, I'm going to plug in the dates of the Diatessaron. The dates are questionable at best. The range is typically given as 160 to 175. However, it could just as easily be as late as 185. It must follow Luke, but otherwise, not much is known about it beyond very late tradition and a very odd interest in this text by Irenaeus. There are some very strange oddities around 4 authors between 170 and 220. I'm going to go ahead and pretend for now that the Catholics are telling the truth here. I think there's a serious possibility that one of these 4 authors is fabricating information and attributing it to other authors. It technically doesn't cause me any problems, so for now I'm granting it. I'm going to plug in the Diatessaron at 175 and move on.